he had a tendency to go through your work. He would be like, well, what I would have done here is I would have included all this information and I would have talked about this way. And then he would grade you down for that. And that was always annoying to us because it's like, well, you're not telling us we did it wrong. You're telling us how you would have done it at your PhD level, and then you're taking our points for it.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to be trying to expose that missing link that's not supposed to exist. Some of the best and brightest minds in the criminology field, doctors and professors, authors and experts, will tell you that there's no link between Koberger studying criminology and the horrific crimes at 112 King Road. But what happens when we explore the possibility that there might be a link of some kind after all? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Crime Rocket. And if you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So let's start by looking at two dimensions. We need to think about Brian as a student who has classmates, right? And then there's the other dimension of Brian as a teacher. And obviously this is within the framework, within the context of criminology. He's a student of criminology, but he's also a teacher of criminology. So there are two dimensions to him in that respect. Now, we've already covered the territory that as a student, his peers in the PhD program regarded him as argumentative, opinionated, contrarian, basically as a mansplainer who often argued with his female peers. And he seemed to have a problem in particular with a lesbian student. Now, as a student, he emerges as the black sheep of his class, as a student, right? And that's not the first time that's happened in his life. And that is according to the statements of about at least 3 classmates. And there's also a sense that because Koberger was so objectionable, and because his LGBTQ remarks were what they were, that he was deliberately isolated and ultimately cancelled by his class. So my sense is the criminology setting certainly played a role in potentially setting Koberger onto his path. In other words, we're talking about the classroom environment, which happened to be within the criminology field, right? And it set him onto his path and into the shadowy area of criminal psychology, right? But not indirectly through the subject matter. It was perhaps through the even more direct, alienating and antagonizing environment that he found himself in. That's not to say he wasn't confrontational himself, or socially awkward himself, or difficult to get along with. Just that if he was the odd one out, his classmates seemed to make that abundantly clear to him as well. And also, they made that clear to him quite quickly. But consider the other side to this. If one of the missions of a criminologist is to understand the criminal mind, another is to understand the societal mind. If one of the victims if one of the things that the criminologist has got to do is look at the victimology, and if it's the idea is to rescue or save victims from perpetrators, well, another is to understand the traumas of victims, the anxieties of victims, the situations of victims, the context of the victim, and also the stresses that we see underpinning criminal cases. Do you think that they understood that with regard to Brian? In a strange sense, then, the initial perpetrator, the initial victimizers in this story, the story of the Idaho student murders, could you say that they are arguably Koberger's classmates? And I suppose you could say, well, that is victim blaming. The question is, who was the original victim in this story? Can you say that because he insulted them, he was turning them into victims, he was bullying them? But he ends up being on the outside. He ends up being the black sheep. He ends up being the outcast. He ends up having a miserable university experience. So how is he the bully in this story? How does he get what he wants? So at the very least, locking Koberger out and turning him into the black sheep, when he was trying to connect, he was trying to reach out, It didn't help the situation. And so ask this question in general. Did this turning him into a black sheep, did it hinder the potential criminal psychology that was forming, or did it foment it? We also know that Koberger turned his own students off, right? Meaning when he was teaching, he also turned off his own students. And that was because of his stricter than they were used to approach. And one of them was Hayden Stinchfield. You heard him at the beginning of this episode. Now, I also want to look at the grading aspect through two dimensions. We've looked at him as a student and him as a teacher. Now let's look at the grading aspect through two dimensions as well. Consider just this idea of Koberger as a strict grader. Where does that come from? Does it have anything to do with his sort of Catholic background? I mean, he went to a Catholic university. But just think of that as just an idea, someone who's strict on others, strict on himself. Consider Koberger, who goes the extra mile and makes extensive notes and critiques of his students' work. That's labor intensive. In a class of 150, if you're going to do that, you're going to give yourself a lot of extra work. And isn't he undertaking to do that? Isn't he volunteering to do the extra work? And you'd imagine in some setting that sort of personal attention might be appreciated. And it seems like the way Hayden Stinchfield explains it is he didn't like the way it was conveyed.
I would have done here is I would have included all this information and I would have talked about this way, and then he would grade you down for that. And that was always annoying to us because it's like, well, you're not telling us we did it wrong. You're telling us how you would have done it at your PhD level, and then you're taking our points for it.
Now consider this other dimension, right? If Koberger's classmates, right, his fellow PhD students, his peers, if they regarded him as a black sheep, one wonders whether that idea grew legs. Did it spread? Did it filter down to the younger students? Did some of his peers also teach the younger students? And did some of that knowledge sort of spread to them? And was there kind of a third dimension that his professors also knew that he was kind of like a problem child, that he was rapidly gaining a bad reputation, that he was rapidly falling out of favor with literally everyone? And did they reach out to him? Did they try and help him along? Or did they decide to impose some kind of academic tough love on him? In other words, by allowing him to be criticized and shot down in a sort of town hanging scenario, right? So at the very least, not settling the matter privately behind closed doors, but instead putting the black sheep on the chopping block when he was, I think, maybe part of it was he was trying to conscientiously do his thing. And perhaps he was trying to over-deliver, trying to reach, trying to prove himself to be a great teacher, only to have it explode in his face. And so did that help the situation, to have him exposed in that way? It's kind of like never a good deed goes unpunished. Did bad Teachergate hinder the potential criminal psychology, or did it hold it back, right? Did it hold it back, or did branding him in one particular way in this public spectacle, did that sort of let it out of the gate? Did it let this criminal psychology out of the gate? Did it sort of bring this animal out of the shadows?
Hayden said that grading style continued for weeks, and then it changed, quite suddenly. And now he wonders, was the change somehow related to the murders?
And that brings us to the next point. There is a strict grading U-turn, right? And if you're thinking about these professors saying there's no link, these experts saying there's no link, well, one of his own students wonders whether there was a link. Was there a link between the strict grading style and then suddenly he doesn't seem to care? So the fact that Koberger was such a strict grader indicates he was putting in an unusual amount of effort. He was paying attention, he was caring, and he defended his assessment. This strict attitude can be interpreted negatively by those who have different standards or who prefer a more casual, tempered approach in general. And maybe his lecturers could have said, you know, we appreciate you grading the way you do, but you need to explain it in a different way, or the standard needs to be applied in at a more accessible manner, or you need to see them as kids who are 5 years younger than you, and in terms of that level, right? But think about this. Koberger's strictness is also, I think, a statement about his personality. It seems like he's a perfectionist. He's strict and regimented in terms of himself. And does that have roots in his upbringing? Does that have cultural roots? And then he's also a strict vegan. He expects high grades from himself as well, and he gets high grades in high school and throughout his university career. And yet at the same time, there's another Koberger as well. There's the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Right beside the academic star is a heroin addict. Right beside the fat kid that the girls laugh at as a kid is another kid that emerges that's so thin that no one even recognizes him, that's able to go on such a strict diet and loses so much weight in such a short time, they think it's a new kid. Right beside the PhD student is a security guard at a rural school. And then the question that we're all asking, right beside this criminology student, well, do we have a criminal? So can you see that you have the same pattern of two individuals living in the same body, in the same life, right beside each other? And so consider the Jekyll-Hydeness in Koberger, grading his students harshly, only to do a U-turn, only to show another side to himself, where the next moment he hardly pays any attention to their grades while giving them high marks. He doesn't do this because he accepts their criticism. It's instead a kind of patronizing response that suggests Koberger's dark side has been activated. And his dark side is condescending and superior and angry. And he believes he's better than they are, but is powerless to show that. And they don't seem to want to believe that. Now let's see if we can apply that to this missing link aspect where Koberger grades himself harshly in certain ways, right? I must be thin. I must make something of myself in order to make himself acceptable to his peers. He applies high standards to himself, thinking that those around him will like and respect him more. Only the reverse happens. What are some sort of scenarios where putting high standards onto yourself are respected by those around you? Wouldn't you say that folks who are quite religious like that idea? And so isn't he doing what is second nature in that respect? In a sense, what he's doing is a kind of self-flagellation. He bends over backwards, he over-delivers. It's a kind of academic overkill. And what does it get him? A kick in the teeth. And then, doesn't he do the same thing? Instead of caring, he stops caring. The next moment, he hardly pays any attention to their grades, but instead perhaps starts to pay attention to how unfair his situation is compared to theirs, how hard he has worked compared to them, while he also sees how much fun they are having. What does he think about that? He starts to stew in this. He watches them have their parties without him. He wishes he could join in and be part of it. But because he feels cancelled, doesn't Koberger feel his dark side beckoning? Doesn't he feel a rising hatred? If he experiences them as condescending and superior, he also experiences a real sense of himself as better than they are. But that's not how it feels in the classroom setting, where he's had all of his agency stripped away from him. And that's now how he feels amongst his peers who have isolated him as well. And so if he's regarded as the black sheep, doesn't he become the black sheep? Except not their version of sheep, his version, the wolf with sharp claws. There's an internal U-turn, isn't there? Just as there was from grading one way to the trying to be nice, trying to reach out sheep, to the lone wolf that finally accepts himself and the ignominy of his situation. In the academic setting, he tried to be the good guy, bleating on about what he thought, only to be shut down. And yet he must continue to make a contribution, continue to make an appearance in this setting. The outcast, the lonely outcast among all the happy grazing sheep, grazing in their fields, luxuriating in the embrace of a sort of hypothetical criminology. And in this Dateline documentary, Stinchfield says, he would often leave the class even before the students did. that he didn't want to be there. Can you see it starts to feel like the fox guarding the hen house? Doesn't he feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that this sort of thing is happening with them as well? They are Dr. Jekylls to one another, but Mr. Hyde to me. Look at who and what they've turned me into, again. And so within that setting of being the outcast, the shepherd, I mean, that's what he was trying to do, right? Shepherd them in terms of their studies. That's what the strict grading is all about, setting boundaries and expecting a high standard from them. And now he allows himself to cross his own boundaries, boundaries that he'd set way back in terms of his backstory. And isn't that how the shepherd becomes the wolf? He gives in to some of those boundaries that he's supposed to, I guess, give into. In the same way that Koberger harshly grades them and then does an about turn, starts to care less and gives them high grades they don't deserve with no feedback, doesn't he start off harshly grading himself, only to flip the switch on himself as well? The harsh grading is a kind of mechanism that holds another side of him at bay, the heroin addict, the down-and-out security guard, the fat boy. And bad Teachergate cruelly opens up a wormhole straight back to that life, back to the struggle, back to all the trauma that he thought he'd left behind him. Now it's right there with him. And then where does he find himself? Alone in the middle of the night, in Pullman, in his apartment. He looks in the mirror, and high school Brian is back. Heroin Brian is right there. Fat, angry Brian has slotted right back into place. But since then, Brian has learned an awful lot about the criminal mind. Not only that, he's on an advanced course. He's 10 years older than he was when all of that was playing out. So why not show them what he knows? Does he want to be bullied forever? And then, if he did commit this crime, did he think his sortie into 1122 King Road would be worthy of a high grade as well? Well, was it? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.